You're listening to the UnSunday Show. Hey friends, welcome to the UnSunday Show with me, Mike Adams, the host of this show, and this is episode 25. We're just cruising right along, and I want to thank you for joining me again today on episode 25. And let's talk a little bit about church history. How about we continue a bit of our discussion from a couple of episodes ago, where we started talking about the Constantinian effect, that whole era right there, where church and state began to be wed, and kind of where that went to from there. Do you remember that quote from Ignatius of Antioch that I've shared so many times on this podcast? It's that quote from the early 2nd century where he said, "Let nothing be done without the bishop present." Don't let anything be done in the church without the bishop present. And if the bishop isn't there, you're kind of just helpless, you're kind of stuck. Nothing should be done without that person's presence. He was the one who would baptize. He was the one who would teach. He was the one who would, administer the Lord's Supper, which had become institutionalized at least by 250 AD, as it moved away from a meal and more into a religious sacrament. And Ignatius' comment way back, around 110 AD, there in the early 2nd century, is where this stuff is rooted. It's where these things began to be formed in seed form, becoming more popular by the mid-3rd century, by about 250 AD, where most of the assemblies had that system in place, the one pastor top-down authority system, which Ignatius had suggested all those years prior. And then, as we saw a couple episodes ago, under the leadership of Constantine and that whole era there of the Constantinian rule, that began to really put that concept on steroids, where Christianity became the official state-run religion. It became the official religion of the state. And of course, bishops, pastors, elders, whatever you want to call them, I believe those are the same thing in the New Testament, where that person, that office, if you will, it became an official office, was elevated above the rest of the people, and it became central within the churches, within the church-run state, if you will. And so all authority really was given to this one person or this group of people within the church to rule the church. And we see Ignatius' statement by the time of Constantine really kind of just getting on steroids and going kind of ballistic in terms of this unchecked authority within the church. And we talked a little bit in that episode too about what happens in a sacral system, in a sacral society. And under Constantine, the sacral society that was in place became a religious sacral system. It became a Christian sacral system. And unfortunately, that continued right up through and beyond the Reformation. What we see in the Reformation is a continuation of what had been put in place as early as Constantine, when that whole idea began to develop, that the church and the state were wed, that the top-down authority of the one bishop or the one pastor was reinforced and required. And that whole sacral system, which we began to see emerge after Constantine in the Roman Catholic Empire, when Christianity became not only legal, but it became the religion of the state. It became the state-run religion. And the church had an army, and the army was there to enforce the rules that the church said had to be enforced. That's a sacral system. And we Christianized that thing. And we talked about last time how that in a sacral system, you really can't object. If you're a citizen in that area, you are considered part of the church just by virtue of the fact that you were alive and living there. And so there was a coercion going on to be baptized, whether or not you were a believer or not, and your children had to be baptized. And so infant baptism was instituted as a sign that you, as a resident in the geographical area, were part of the state-run church. And if anyone disagreed with that opinion, they would be punished, up to and including death. And so the idea of personal faith, of faith in Jesus Christ, really kind of went by the wayside during that time. And all you had to do to be part of the church was be born in a geographical area. And then, of course, that was followed by infant baptism, and that infant baptism is what made you part of the sacral church, the state-run church at that time. And we talked a little bit, too, about how I believe that's a throwback to an old covenant definition of the people of God. You remember that under the old covenant with the ancient nation of Israel, all you had to do to be part of the people of God was be born, because the people of God, the concept of the people of God was a physical nation. Belief wasn't really on the radar. All you had to do was be born, and on the 8th day circumcised, and you were a part of that old covenant community, that old covenant people of God called Israel. And all of that was apart from personal faith of any kind. That's why you'll remember in John 3 when Jesus had his conversation with Nicodemus, which, again, bad joke here, but I think is the first occurrence of Nick at Night. You'll remember that when Jesus had that conversation with Nicodemus, and he said to Nicodemus, you have to be born again. That must have just blown Nick's mind. That must have blown him away that he would have to be born again. Jesus was saying your first birth, Nicodemus, didn't take. All that did was bring you into the physical nation, into the physical people of God. But if you want to really know God, if you want to really know me, then you have to be born again. There has to be a second birth for you, Nicodemus, because your first birth didn't take. Because in that old covenant economy, a second birth wasn't required. If you wanted to be part of the physical nation, the physical people of God, all you had to do was be born into the nation of Israel at that time. Well, there's a sense in which the whole Constantinian era took us back to that. It took us back to that time where you just had to be born. If you were born in a geographic location that the state church was in charge of and running, you were considered part of the church. You were considered part of the people of God, whether you knew him or not. And again, infant baptism was the tool that was used to mark you out, if you will. And so that's the system that we had in place after the Constantinian era. And that system, unfortunately, continued on and got worse and worse. And the whole history of that thing, we don't really have time to go into all of that and into the Crusades and everything that happened under the guise of the cross. But when we get to the time of the Reformation, where those reformers that we hear about so much started to see that justification was by faith alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, that was a great thing. But I believe more needed to be done, and I believe that the reformers stopped short in a lot of ways. And so I want to talk about that a little bit today, too. My wife sent me a quote recently by Barbara Brown Taylor. And I love this quote. I want to read it to you because I think it contributes to the conversation that we're having today in this episode. She said this, quote, Jesus was not killed by atheism and anarchy. He was brought down by law and order, allied with religion, which is always a deadly mix. Then she continues, beware those who claim to know the will of God and are prepared to use force, if necessary, to make others conform. Beware those who cannot tell God's will from their own. End of quote. And unfortunately, by the time of the Reformation, conformity to the rules through external force was commonplace. And as the Reformation began to unfold, there were a group of people known as the Anabaptists who held a view in opposition to the Roman Catholic Church that the church, the assembly, is made up of people who had personally come to faith in Jesus Christ, who had personally believed in Jesus Christ. Not just those in a geographic area, but those who really professed Jesus in a personal way, on a personal level. In addition to that, the Anabaptists believed that the body of Christ, that the church, the assembly, the ecclesia, was to be an expression of Christ in the world by every member functioning, by everyone in it exercising spiritual gifts, not by a select few, not by a top-down authority, not by a hierarchical structure within the church where only a few get to exercise their gifts and the rest have to sit still and listen, but rather the Anabaptists believe that passages like 1 Corinthians 14 that described every member functioning within the body were legitimate. And so they began to object. They began to try and get vocal about such things. And they had, at least initially, from what I've read and from what I've seen, they had a little bit of success early on, but that success quickly faded. It seems like Luther in Germany and Zwingli in Switzerland both had similar ideas to some of the Anabaptist teaching on what the assembly is and of the functioning of spiritual gifts. At least early on in the Reformation, they had some sympathetic agreement with many of the Anabaptists in those areas. But as the Reformation continued to move along, that changed. And eventually both Luther and Zwingli abandoned that idea completely in favor of keeping a state-run church, in favor of keeping a church where everyone in a geographic location was considered part of the church. And again, infant baptism was the tool to signify that membership. But early on, it seems that it wasn't that way. Well, what do you do if you're an Anabaptist? By the way, Anabaptist just means rebaptizers. It means those who believe that infant baptism was wrong, and when someone comes to faith in Jesus, they needed to be rebaptized. But remember, in a sacral society, and in this case, a Christian sacral society, you're going against the very grain of the system in saying that. You're a troublemaker because the sacral system can't have you thinking independently like that. You have to conform to the rules, and the rules in this case meant that everyone in a geographic location was considered a believer, and they were baptizing infants as a result of being forced into conformity to that idea. And so here's the Anabaptists saying, well, we believe in believers' baptism. We believe in a church and an ecclesia, an assembly that's made up of those who have personal faith in Jesus, apart from where they live, or irrespective of where they live. This is about personal faith from every tribe, nation, and language under heaven. Well, that gets you into trouble. And what happened with the Anabaptists is they began to be persecuted heavily, and many were martyred. Many were murdered for their beliefs, for their views of what the ecclesia is and what the ecclesia was and was to be. And so you've got the Reformers who, on one hand, had the podiums, they had the public speaking platforms, they were not being persecuted. And on the other hand, you had the Anabaptists who had different ideas about what the church is, who were being persecuted, and so they couldn't meet publicly. There was no place for them to go. They had to hide out. And they weren't allowed to meet and formulate together their ideas of what the church is. And so there were isolated pockets of these people known as Anabaptists who were really not allowed to say anything. They were kept under wraps. They were persecuted. And many, like I said, were murdered because of their view of church. I guess when someone disagrees with you and you are mad at them and you want to get rid of them, it's easier to eliminate them by first calling them a heretic. You put them in the category of heretic, I guess it makes it easier to execute punishments such as death, and that certainly is what happened during that time. And so while there were many good things that came out of the Reformation, everything in the Reformation wasn't rosy, especially if you were an Anabaptist or in another group who believe something different about what the ecclesia is, about what the church of Jesus is in the world. You could die because the Reformers had the public platform. The Reformers had the public speaking platform. And it seems that had they continued on with the Anabaptist way of thinking, that they themselves would have fallen under heavy persecution by the Roman Catholic Church that was present in the day and had all the power. And so as the Reformers continued to reform their ideas, they kept those aspects of the Roman Catholic Church that kept them safe, namely a state-run church. I mean, if you want to defeat the church with an army, one way to do it is to start another church and have a bigger army. And that's basically what happened. Sure, that's, a general statement in a way, but, looking back at it, that's what happened. So what we have in the history of the church from Ignatius forward in about 110 AD is this putting in place of pastors and bishops, this hierarchy within the assembly, which is foreign to the New Testament. It's not there. It doesn't exist. Who put pastors in charge? Well, we talked about that last time. It wasn't Jesus. It wasn't the apostles. It wasn't the New Testament. It was other pastors. It was church history that put pastors in charge and kept them in charge, and those pastors that are in charge are interested in keeping the power. They're not going to give it up, most of them, unless the Holy Spirit does a great work. But that's what we see throughout church history. Most of church history is in alignment with top-down authority, which Jesus said very plainly, this shall not be among you. And yet, look around and see what we have. That's exactly what we have. We have that hierarchy. And so Barbara Brown Taylor's statement, beware those who claim to know the will of God and are prepared to use force if necessary to make others conform, end of quote, is spot on. It nails it completely. Because that's church history. Church history is replete with that. And so much of what we have in our modern church settings has been handed to us, has come down to us through the vehicle of church history. Now, we don't have a religious sacral system or a Christian sacral system in a geographic area anywhere, at least not where I live. But what we do have is we have small sacral systems, don't we? We call them denominations. Or we just refer to the building on the corner as, church of the whatever. And it becomes its own sacral system. In other words, if you're going to be a part of that, you have to conform to what they want you to do. In order to participate in that, they may require some sort of formal church membership, which we've talked about a lot in this podcast, or some other hoops to jump through in order to be accepted as part of what they're doing. Yeah, they don't have an army. They're probably not going to come after you and threaten your life, but if you want to be a part of what's going on there, you have to conform to that mini sacral system, mini being M-I-N-I, that mini sacral system. And so in many ways, that's still with us today. The hierarchy, the top-down authority, the things that aren't present in the New Testament that Jesus specifically warned us against are what's all around us. And those things have been given to us by church history. And that started as early as Ignatius in about 110 AD, saying, don't let anything be done without the bishop present. He's the man. The pastor is the man. And so now we look around and we're so pastor-centric, we don't know how to function otherwise, and we think it's normal. But it's not normal. I believe in many ways it's a harmful expression of what Christ is doing in the church, and it's not an accurate reflection of the ecclesia, of the assembly. So I'll leave you with that for today. I appreciate you tuning in with me again, and remember you can find me online at UnSunday.com, UnSunday.com. Until next time, I will let you go, and thank you so much for joining me, and y'all take care.